6 things that our great-grandparents did better than us. And the first one would be acquiring skill sets. Our great-grandparents knew that if they didn't know how to do certain things, then it simply wasn't going to get done, or they didn't have an option. Definitely preserving your food, learning how to can, how to ferment are high on my list of skill sets, but there's also things like wood carving, making your own spoons, knowing how to do carpentry. So many craftsman level skill sets that our great grandparents knew and knew how to do well, that we, for the most part, as modern society, have definitely lost. Though thankfully there's quite a few people that are keeping those skill sets alive that we can learn from. The next thing is, this could go definitely with the skill sets, but that is sewing. So this was actually my mom's very first sewing kit when she was a girl, and so she gave it to me. It was my sewing kit when I was a girl, and I am obviously not a girl anymore, and it is still my sewing kit. So fabric scissors are a must when it comes to sewing. These scissors should never be used for paper, and my children know, and so does my husband now, if you touch mom's sewing scissors, you're going to get it. We have a drawer with all kinds of scissors in it. You don't ever use mom's sewing scissors unless you're cutting fabric or thread. That's up first. Then you definitely want to have a seam ripper, especially if you are a beginner sewer, because you will be ripping out seams at some point or time. And then I've got lots of different just pens in here, lots of needles. This is a great, especially if you are doing hemming, having one of these so you can have the guide, so you can make sure that you're just at a glance, getting that exactly where you need it to be. Whenever I'm hemming pant legs, that is one that I use often. I just thread the needles that I have going currently here. This is great because they just go like that right on the top, so they're easy to grab. And then this is my push pin cushion, and lots of different threads. This is actually my thimble. If you're going through really thick fabric or doing a long project where you're sewing by hand, a thimble is great. The metal ones I just never could keep on my fingers when I was little and I was learning how to sew. And so this is a leather thimble, especially for quilting. And so this is just the one that I love and use. I don't even use the metal ones. I think it's kind of what you get used to. Anyways, this one is one of my favorites. And then I've got a hodgepodge of lots of different threads in here, different colors. This is quilting thread. It's a stronger thread, a little bit thicker than a lot of your other, if you're just doing like, this is a much finer thread here, but we've got lots of different colors. I also have a rotary cutter in here when I am cutting out quilting or doing along a board and just going for a straight line there. And this is actually one of the quilts that I made. So I pieced this together by hand. I did sew using the sewing machine, just these long single strips here on, but the binding and all of the quilting and all of the individual piecing, get that spit out there, is what I did for this quilt, which is just like a more decorative, like a lap throw quilt here. But just learning some basic sewing so that if you need to hem a pair of pants or you rip a seam, anything like that on your basic clothes, that you're able to just repair that, learn how to sew on a button if a button pops off. Some of just those very simple, you don't have to become a whole seamstress and sew clothes, even though that is something that our great grandparents did. My mom sewed a lot of my clothes when I was little. I didn't necessarily appreciate it back then, but I definitely appreciate it now. And those are the dresses that I saved, and well, she saved first, I should say, because she had put so much time into them by sewing them. But then I used those on my own daughter and was able to get pictures. And so that was just really special and fun because it was dresses that I wore when I was a little girl and that my mom made. So learning, even if it's just basic sewing skills, is a great thing to do. The other thing, or I should say one of the other things, number 3, that our great grandparents did better than us was cooking from scratch. Now I know a lot of you cook from scratch, but they didn't have the convenience items, simply weren't available. I don't actually know when Doritos or like a lot of the chip companies started coming out, But if you look back into like the 1930s and the 40s, especially during the 1930s and the early 40s when the US was still during the Great Depression, most people didn't have money and were not buying any type of convenience foods. And especially there was not the plethora of convenience foods that we have today. So our great-grandparents knew how to cook from scratch, knew how to make all of their own meals and their foods, and they did so. Not only did they cook from scratch, but they knew how to use all the parts of something. So when they made chicken for dinner, they made sure that they were saving that carcass, they were making chicken broth with it and using that. So you can go and check out this video if you want to learn how to make and can your own chicken broth. And I also have using chicken broth and homemade tomato sauce to create a delicious homemade tomato soup. So you can check out some of those videos on the cooking playlist. So number 4 on our list is buying and using local. So as a homesteader, we raise and do a lot of our own stuff here. However, finding local sources is something that our great-grandparents did much better. Now, granted, depending on how old you are and how old your great-grandparents were, some of them didn't even have the big, large supermarkets that we do now. They really weren't even an option. People were not driving, they weren't spending gas, some depending on where they were, if they had vehicles that would go very far, but they weren't traveling and doing the shopping and the driving that we do today. Plus there weren't those options. So they were buying local. You might not have had your own dairy animal. We don't have our own dairy animal, but I'm very excited to tell you, I just found a local dairy source. I'm so excited. Mine actually went out of business, sadly, that we were using prior to that, selling to the public. And so I found another source. But that brings me right back to this point. Even if you don't do your own dairy animals, depending on where you are in your homestead journey, instead of buying the milk from the store, is there a local source? Now, sometimes this, you really have to do some sleuthing, but in most cases, you could find somebody for buying some of the things. Doesn't mean we'll be able to get everything local, but the more that we can do local and support, not only does that help them be able to do more and have more options for local, but it also may mean that you become that local source. So for a lot of us who have backyard chickens, which I did not gather the eggs for a couple of days, so I've got a big bounty here of that. But if you have excess beyond what you're using for your family, can you offer those as a local option in your community? We're looking at doing that with more of the meat. With chickens, we're offering that beyond just what we raise for ourselves to our community as we see demand increase. So if people see that there are people that are searching out and they want to buy local, that can be all it takes for someone to decide, okay, we're going to start offering this. So doing as much as you can local. I know that in a lot of instances, not every single thing that you need is available local, but the more that we seek that out and perpetuate that, the more will become available in our small local communities. Number 5, your work becomes your art form. When I was little, I was out helping my dad fix fence, and it became quite long and arduous, and I was really bored and done with the fixing of the fences. However, there was more fence that still needed to be fixed. So I was actually holding the wire for him while he was repairing it. And I think I must have been quite grumpy or probably not holding it tight enough like I was supposed to. And so he told me, any job that you're doing is worth doing right, and it's worth doing well. And that's always stuck with me because we all have times where we're not really that enchanted with our work, or something that we're doing kind of feels like drudgery, but that has always stuck with me even now, all of these years later. And I think that that's something, now not everybody, but I would say general as a society, not a lot of people have true pride in their work or stick with something long enough that it actually becomes an art form and they're like a master craftsman at whatever it is they're doing. So I think that that's something that we definitely can look back to our great-grandparents, kind of like I was talking about, you know, when they made things back in the day, they lasted. Like I have a 1930s cast iron skillet. That thing is still going strong, and it is better made than my newer ones. And a lot of those things, like I have a lot of actually vintage and antique things they built them to last. That's why they're like 100 years old, and that most of them still work and are usable depending on what it is. Nowadays, you buy, anybody? You buy like a new stove or a new appliance, and like if you get 10 years out of it, you feel lucky. And then you've got like the 1970s or 1980s stove, and that thing just keeps going on forever and ever, even though it's just ugly as sin. Anyways, maybe that's just been my experience, but I feel like people back in the day took a lot more pride, and they made things that were meant to be used and would hold up and they would last. And the final 6 is community. Our great-grandparents knew that they had to rely on their neighbors and people in their community, and they weren't afraid to jump in and help. That's when, like, going really far back in the day, you had barn raisings. But even now within our neighborhood, it was a number of years ago, and our neighbors needed to put on a new roof, and so a bunch of the people in the neighbors, we just jumped in and spent a day or two, and we put their new roof on for them. It can even be something as simple as your volunteer fire departments, for those of you that live in areas where we do, where you don't have a fire department and it is volunteer. And we're actually seeing such a decline in the members who are volunteers that sometimes calls go out and there's nobody to respond. So bringing back that community element, getting to know your neighbors and getting out there and helping one another is one of the really big key things that I think our great-grandparents did better. And I hope that we continue to bring back and to start that upward trend of all of these things. If you want to catch more things about what our great-grandparents was like and back in the day, then you'll definitely want to go and watch this video where my dad, who was born in the 1930s, talks about what it was like growing up back during the Great Depression and even after that, but in a very rural community. So you can go and hear it straight from the horse's mouth.